Hi everyone. This presentation is called Intervention Techniques, Phonemic Awareness, Phonics, and Fluency. So the content of this presentation will probably be helpful for the tutoring assignment that you're doing for this course. This course will go beyond teaching children just how to actually read text and get into written expression and comprehension and vocabulary as well. But this presentation is zooming in on the foundation skills. Okay. Even though the content of this presentation will help you with your tutoring assignment, let's put that project to the side for a minute and put on our reading specialist or ESL specialist hat. Throughout this entire course, I want you to be having that lens. Some of you are working as a classroom teacher right now, or as a para, or as maybe in Title I or something like that in your school. I want you to put on the hat that you're here to get an additional license, and I want you to be using that lens or that hat throughout this entire course. So we're here because we care about our students, but we really care about this particular population of students, the struggling students. So let's think about who we are teaching. For this presentation, we're zooming in on kids who have trouble with decoding or reading fluently. So when we're thinking about those kids, let's think about what they need. They might be somebody with dyslexia, could be diagnosed or undiagnosed. Somebody with dysgraphia, most likely undiagnosed. I almost never see that term come up in schools. English language learners, and there's a huge range in that background. That can mean a child who's coming from a super educated and wealthy family and they're visiting the Boston area for their parents' doctoral program or teaching fellowship. Or that could be the other end of the spectrum and somebody who's just arrived from a refugee camp. So the amount of background knowledge, prior education, and trauma that these students have experienced or not varies. So when I say ELL students, that population is so wide. There's really no way we can zoom in on what the stereotype is because there are so many different learners in that group. We're also here to serve typical students who are getting poor Tier 1 instruction. So they might be neurologically fine and there's no reason they should be struggling with reading, but because of the model of reading instruction that's used in the school, they are struggling. And so they end up in Tier 2, not because of a neurological deficit, but just because curriculum has failed them. We might be doing our teaching in small groups or one-on-one. When you're working in a school, it's almost always small groups. Occasionally there are one-on-one situations, but usually that's just for special ed. So now let's wear our specialist hat and think about when we would be teaching. When we're working with our struggling readers, whether it's decoding or fluency level work, we could be working in a pull-out model or push-in model. So pull out, and you might know some of this because you're in schools, but pull out is when the specialist takes the children, plucks them from their classroom, and goes and work elsewhere in your office or classroom. Push in is when the specialist works in the classroom. And there are pros and cons to both of those models. I can't say that one is better than the other. As a reading specialist, I tended to prefer pull out because then I could really control the learning environment. I could get rid of all the distractions from the classroom. Some classrooms were run like a tight ship and others were chaos. I could get rid of any of that noise or whatever. I could also zoom in on really low-level content without offending or embarrassing the students. Not such a big deal with first graders, but when you're working with a third, fourth, or fifth grader who's on a really low level, it's nice that they're not with their peers. And if they're doing low-level remedial work, it's in the privacy and safety of your little classroom. Also, it allowed me to put kids in groups that were more closely aligned to their level and less about just the convenience of being in one classroom. So instead of pulling the first graders from Mrs. Smith or pushing in and working with Mrs. Smith's first graders and then pushing in and working with Mrs. Brown's first graders, I would pluck students from all the first grade classes, arrange them in groups based on their specific needs, and then I was so much more targeted and strategic. Yet, the obvious downsides to that are that there can be some shame or discomfort with being pulled out of the classroom. For some kids, that it works the opposite way. They do not like leaving the classroom. They just want to be with their peers. So these are all things that we need to kind of take into consideration when we're figuring out what is the best way to serve our struggling students. Sometimes the interventions happen during literacy block when the whole class is doing literacy, and sometimes you might have to stretch it to other times of the day. I used to see kids during morning work time because that was sort of a waste for them if they were really below level. They weren't really getting any independent work done anyway, so that was a good time to pluck children. Um, Another time would be the end of the day when it's kind of everything's falling apart anyways in the classroom, and I could grab kids and squeeze out another 30 minutes of instruction in my quiet little haven. That would work too. Um, so think about now what your school does. It might not necessarily be a right or wrong situation, but think about the pros and cons of how things are looking where you work. Do you wish there was more pull out or push in? Do you wish things were lined up better so the specialist could serve the kids during literacy block, or does that not matter? There is not one ideal way to deliver instruction and intervention because it is very specific to that particular school. So people at the local level within the school need to be really savvy at figuring out what does our population need, what kinds of teachers and needs do we have, and how do we solve our scheduling problems. Those of us who are reading specialists and ESL specialists have to be able to teach the following. Now, this isn't all that we teach. We, depending on how our role is, broken up in school, we might also be doing written expression, comprehension, vocabulary. But for sure, we should be able to remediate phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency issues. And depending on the level of our student, not necessarily the grade level, but the skill level, that could be anywhere in the phonics world. That could be down at letter knowledge. We could be starting there, or we could be way up at complex orthography and morphology. Now I put sight words on there too. It's not sight words aren't phonics, but because they are the irregular words, I still loop it into the phonics category because phonics are the rule-based words, even with the complex patterns. And then sight words are the ones that don't follow the rules. So they're kind of taught side by side because we're teaching them as, the rule breakers. And it helps if you get into the word origin to explain why it is that they seem to be playing unfair. Some of our students, they have made it past the decoding level, but their fluency is still so labored. So we might be working on phrasing, punctuation, or this could be all linked to their comprehension work as well. As a specialist, you need to decide, and this might be a decision that's made for you from your principal or your reading coach or whoever is your superior. But it's also something that you might be able to choose a little bit for yourself. So are you going to be following the classroom curriculum and giving kids a double dose? Are you following something like the Orton-Gillingham scope and sequence? And reading specialists, when you go through the reading clinic, that will be ingrained in your brain and you will have internalized that. So it'll probably be hard for you to do anything but follow that internalized scope and sequence. Or perhaps there's another intervention program that you're following. So these are some decisions that you or your district might be making are you being very problem solving oriented where you use your brain and expertise to decide what to do? Or is there an intervention program that's telling you what to do? Another decision we have to make as specialists is how do we plan? I recommend setting goals for each specific group or pair or individual student and sharing those goals with the student. That keeps you focused and the student. So that might be built into your practice already. You might already have to post your learning objectives and things like that in your classroom. But I find it helpful to almost like put the Common Core out. Yeah, sure, that's on the board. But more importantly is telling students we're focusing on spelling vowel teams, making choices when we're spelling with vowel teams. That kind of very specific student-friendly language is helpful for you and your child to know exactly where you are on that continuum. Now, of course, we're using progress monitoring data as well. That informs our teaching. That helps us know if what we're doing is working and if we're on the right track. It also helps us communicate to other people that what we're doing is worthwhile. A lot of my planning comes from the observations right in that lesson. So I always take notes during the lesson or directly after if the lesson's chaotic, and I am jotting down the big red flags that I saw or the big light bulb moments that I saw, or if I know exactly what needs to come next because I saw how much review was needed or how much progress was made and I want to zoom forward, I usually know at the end of each lesson what I want to do next. But the amount of hours I teach a week, I can't, you think you're going to remember it, but you don't. So writing down observation notes is a huge deal. And it sounds so basic, but we're all making these amazing observations in our brain and poof, I know they just melt right away. So a big thing we're going to talk about in this class is using templates for our lesson planning and our record keeping. It helps us be strategic, it helps us with accountability, and it makes planning so much easier because you look at last week or yesterday's lesson and you have your answers right there for your next lesson. Now, if you're a specialist, you might be working on your own in your own little island, which can be nice if you like to be the boss of yourself, like I do. But it's also isolating and it's not always beneficial to the kids for you to be in your own little la la land and not connecting with the child's, with their other teachers, with their classroom teacher. So ideally, there would be a way for you to communicate and be in touch with the classroom teacher when you're working as a specialist. That would be the ideal situation. You might not be able to collaborate on every lesson, but you're keeping each other in the loop about the progress that's happening. And then one thing with progress monitoring is how do we know if it's enough progress? So if the benchmark was here and in the fall they're way down here, but then they creep up to here, how do we know if that's enough progress? Well, there are ways to calculate their growth rate, and that helps us know for the students that are way far below benchmark and they haven't yet hit benchmark, but they are making progress, we can judge if their progress is ambitious enough to close the gap. If it is, yes, we figured it out. We're going to keep with our strategic plan, keep going. If it's not, then we need to keep problem solving. What are we skipping or missing in terms of their intervention needs? So what is it that we are monitoring, or how do we progress monitor? So for our really, really low kids, it helps to progress monitor every 2 to 4 weeks. You might not see insane amounts of growth. So it's not like every 2 weeks you'll be, whoa, that was impressive. But it's more like if you have all those data points on the graph, that might serve you well in terms of if you're working towards special ed eligibility, or if you're really concerned about some really low students and you don't want to go down the wrong path for too long if it's not working, then I would suggest very frequent. I mean, once a month would be appropriate as well, but sometimes every 2 weeks could be helpful. Now, you may or may not use grade level progress monitoring tools. When we're doing the official benchmark testing, you know, fall, winter, spring, that usually has to be the grade level materials because that's your time to check in and see who's at, above, or below benchmark. But for progress monitoring, if you have a student who's really low, their progress might not show up on a grade level tool. If I have a second grader who's working at a kindergarten or first grade level, doing a second grade oral reading fluency quiz, they're probably not going to show growth because that's so far beyond what we're even working on in intervention group. So it might help to use just the nonsense word screener or first grade oral reading fluency, and you'll be able to see some incremental progress there. Again, that's not data that you would input into your data system at school because it's not their grade level, but for your record keeping and your knowledge of seeing if they're making progress, it's helpful. Schools should be using something like Dibbles, Acadience, or Easy CBM or AimsWeb. If your school is only using what are they called? The Fontes and Pinnell benchmark screener. I don't know what the name of that is. I can't remember. or if they're using only, see, I don't even remember the names. I put them out in my brain. Anyways, if they're using the DRA, the one with the numbers, oh, she's a 12, she's a 14. The DRA, the guided reading ones, level A, B, C, D, E, those have no science behind them. Those letters and numbers were made up by those publishers and they mean nothing. Is it helpful to hear the child read aloud and answer comprehensions questions? Yes, it's helpful, especially when everyone in the class is doing the same passage. You can compare them and you can that helps you get a sense of who's where. But if they're making progress, you're not going to see progress that has statistical value at all using those measures. Dibbles, Acadians, Easy CBM, and Ames Web are reliable and valid. So that means a child who's tested on like a first grade oral reading fluency, they're probably going to get just about the same score on any of the oral reading fluency probes because they somehow have figured out the kinds of word patterns and the structure and the complexity of those sentence structures. Whereas a level C Fontes and Pinnell book, if you picked 6 different level C books, a child could pass or fail willy-nilly, and so it's not going to be valid or reliable. There's no science behind it. You would not want that to be your school's data system. Sadly, in Massachusetts especially, that there's a huge balanced literacy push and there's DRAs and Fontes and Pinnell assessments everywhere. And that's sometimes the only assessment a school has. Anyways, put that aside. When we have our progress monitoring data, when we're a specialist, especially reading specialists, this is going to help you regroup your groups as frequently as needed because you're going to see some kids hit their stride with you and up they go, and other kids are plugging along slowly. So just because a child enters a group with you doesn't mean they're stuck in that spot all year. These groups should be fluid and flexible. Usually I did a big overhaul every 6 to 8 weeks when I worked as a reading specialist, but at any time I moved children in and out of groups. The teacher and I would be chatting about something that we noticed and we would shift them around. The big overhaul would be like every 6 to 8 weeks with a big progress monitoring check-in, but there's no reason to keep anybody in a group that isn't targeted for their exact needs. So we would swap. And it helps to do it based on need, not convenience. So that means the whole grade level should be on board with each other and flexible so that the specialist can create groups that serve kids specifically tailored to what they need, as opposed to, oh, 9 o'clock is Mrs. Brown's time, 9:30 is Mrs. Smith. No, 9 o'clock should be the kids with really poor phonemic awareness and letter knowledge from the whole grade, because a struggling reader not all struggling readers look alike. So the bottom 6 strugglers in a particular classroom might not need to be in the same group. Of course, benchmark testing just keeps happening 3 times a year. That is not as critical for a reading specialist because you're progress monitoring all along. So there shouldn't really be any surprises for you in January or May because you know these kids, you're progress monitoring regularly. Depending on where you work, you might be on your own, totally independent, or you might have a lot of people keeping track of what you're doing and how you're doing it. So there's pros and cons to all ends of that spectrum, of course. It's important to be accountable. I want to send teachers out into the field that are prepared to be accountable and can explain the good work that they do and prove the good work that they do. But I also know that not all principals, administrators, or frankly, even reading specialists and coaches have the same depth of knowledge, that there's not an equal necessarily knowledge or understanding of reading development in the reading brain. So it's possible that you're working for someone and answering to someone who knows a lot less than you about the reading brain and about reading intervention. And that is certainly frustrating. But that's part of work in life. So think about, that's just something that you have to navigate on a personal level because all these situations are very different and it's a real part of your job. Just being a genius with solving reading problems is helpful, but you don't work in a vacuum. You work in a public school with personalities and bureaucracy and red tape and parents and schedules. And so navigating all of that is part of your life as well. So I just built you the whole context, where we're working, who we're working with, are we doing push in, pull out, what kind of testing? That's the context of all of this. When you want to teach phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency, you're not just in your little bubble with your happy little learning tools. Unless you come work for me at Cohasset Learning Studio, and then you can be in that little bubble. But when you're in a school, there's a lot of other structures and schedules and people in place. So we know that exists, so let's just put them to the side for a second and let's zoom in on you and your work. Let's think about that structured literacy learning environment that you are going to create. So when you're doing this with your students, step one, it kind of goes without saying, but you have to keep them interested. You have to get them to attend to you and be alert. And that can be tricky for sure. So you need to be lively. But you're doing it all day, so you need to be lively all day for these children. Something that I think about often is when children are working with us, they're reading specialists or ESL specialists, we are asking them to do the hardest things. This is probably the hardest part of their day when they come to see us because we're zooming in on their weaknesses and we're having them chip away at it. It's like when I go to the gym, I'm not really into working out. That is the hardest, frankly, worst part of my day. Do I love it? Yes and no, but I know a lot is going to be asked of me and it's going to be painful. Most days, if I've got my good attitude, I can handle it and I can follow what that trainer says. But other days, I'm just, I don't feel like it. So that's our students when they come to us too. Keep that in mind. Because I'm used to seeing, well, in a public school setting, I usually saw kids for about 30 minutes at a time. Some people have 45 or 60 minutes, but often it's short snippets, like 20 or 30 minutes. So the activities are going to be brief and varied. I would have a structure for how you want that whole week of lessons to look. Maybe you see them 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week, whatever. Think about that whole week and what you want to accomplish on the week, because you might not be able to change the world in one 20-minute lesson, but 2, 3, 4, 5 20-minute lessons that week, you might be able to accomplish something big with them. So when we're doing these small groups at the decoding level, we're working on usually automaticity with something. They're going to be over learning. So our flashcards are almost always a part of these drills. Even if we're working with upper level kids and we're getting to fluency, we want them to have this automatic recognition of these patterns. So I really can't imagine teaching decoding or fluency work without having some kind of drill as a warm-up for each lesson or most lessons. There's also going to be some sort of predictable routine. So it could always be like, okay, we do our phonological awareness, we do our flashcards, we do our practice, we do our new topic, and then we read or spell after. So there's some kind of routine and rhythm to it, just like with your structured literacy template you're using for this tutoring project in this course. You also develop some sort of routine or template with your kids, so there's repetition happening. Now it's highly pre-planned, meaning you're not winging it that day. You're not Monday morning, oh, Mrs. Smith, what are you teaching in first grade this week? Oh yeah, okay, I'll do some games with short eye. No. You are really you know exactly what your students need, and you plan out that lesson or that week of lessons in advance. Yet you also know these are struggling students and they're going to throw us curveballs all week long. So you're going to allow for those teachable moments where you go off to the side or you back up a bit or you zoom forward here or there. So yes, it's highly pre-planned, but you are working in the moment with your kids and being responsive to them. Now, because we have children who could be reluctant learners, they could have executive functioning issues, attention issues. There's a lot going on for us as well in terms of how we need to help them with setting goals, self-monitoring, self-regulating, and staying on task. So again, we're not teaching these little robotic struggling learners. These struggling learners come with baggage of all kinds, and that could be hunger, fatigue, social dramas, uh, neurological issues like executive functioning and attention problems. So all these things get pumped into our lesson as well. So of course we have to think about that. Now there's a little pause note at the bottom here. You might not have taught too many lessons or any at all by the time you're watching this presentation. But this is something I want you to be thinking about with structured literacy. And you can come back to this slide maybe once you've taught a few lessons and think about, am I covering all this? Is this how I design my lessons? Okay, now we get to go into the fun stuff. If we were in class, I'd be doing this for you live, on the document cam or whatever. But I tried to put as many clips on the screen as I could to help illustrate how we actually teach phonemic awareness and decoding and fluency issues. So let's start with phonemic awareness. All of you have given the PASS, the phonemic awareness screener test, for your struggling students for your case study project. And you were probably alerted to some weaknesses there. Most struggling readers, they come to us with a weakness in phonology. That's the root cause of it for many of our struggling readers. We can develop that systematically by working at the beginning of each lesson, starting with phonemic awareness drills. Now, not included on your slide are two resources. Equipped for Reading Success by Kilpatrick and the Hegarty program. Those are two pre-packaged phonemic awareness programs that you could use as an add-on to your intervention groups, to your Orton-Gillingham work, whatever. What I like about them is you are not forced to come up with these drills and word lists ahead of time. The pages are already, they have all the levels and they have all the words and the little drills that you'll run through. And so over time, it's just like, lifting weights at the gym, but it's the phonemic awareness version of that. It's increasing the sophistication of those little sound tasks and gradually making it harder. So buying one of those programs, investing in one of those, you will be delighted. Not only will it save you time planning things out, but they are so effective. All right, so table that. Now let's think of some more fun things that actually involve some touching as well that could be fun to do. My number one is sorts. Whenever there's an issue with phonological, like spelling and reading, like if they're getting their b and p sound mixed up in words or having trouble with a and those short vowels, sorts are the way to zoom in on that issue. And because they're just focusing on those 2 or 3 targeted sounds at a time, and you can prepare your little word list. You can tell them and model them. Oh yes, short A, short E. Those are complicated. Our mouth looks the same when we make those words. Let's take a look in the mirror. So you give them a little teaching first, and then you try sorting. You don't need to sort all 5 vowel sounds at once. I would zoom in on the 2 tricky ones and push the others to the side. Maybe it's something like the CH and the SH sound. You could look in the mirror and explain to them how ch is a quick puff of air versus sh is a slow flow of air. So you'd want to link that oral motor with the auditory, and then maybe you can have a tactile piece where you're matching the letters, and then sort it. Have a whole bunch of SH and CH words that you're ready to dictate, and the child puts a chip in a cup or puts a bead on the string, or however you want to show that they're sorting those 2 sounds. Alcona boards are near and dear to my heart. I use these all the time as well. These are just index cards that I have cut and laminated. And then the fun thing is that you can get all sorts of cute little mini erasers. These are little unicorns. You don't just have to use boring old little chips or counters. You can get cute little manipulatives, and you can do your sound segmenting or sound blending with those. Reading rods, you can see those little Unifix cubes. They're the blue and red ones in the corner there. That's the brand name is Reading Rod. You could also make your own with blank Unifix cubes. And what I love about them is that they are color coded. So they have the vowels are red and the consonants are blue. Same idea as the Wilson magnets, where the consonants are one color, yellow, and the vowels are red. Both of those, yes, they have print, so you might be thinking that's not phonemic awareness. It straddles phonemic awareness and phonics, and it's linking the two. Why? Because each magnet or each block stands for one sound. So technically, the TH or CH or whatever digraph should be written on one magnet or one little block, and that shows the students that it's one sound. So clicking those together, breaking them apart, that is bridging that gap between phonological work and phonics work. Most of this stuff is not expensive. If you buy your Wilson magnets once, you've got that whole kit for whatever it is, $30, and that's that. Reading rods are probably about the same price. Elkonin boards and chips are completely free. Sorts are completely free. So you can see that little cute owl one right there. I happen to own that one. I think that's the only sort I've purchased because it just seems pointless to buy them when you can just think of them so easy. So you can have any little cup or T-chart that you can write on paper or anything to do the sorting. You don't need to buy anything from Lakeshore or Learning Resources or anything like that. Of course, they're pretty and fun, and I love that. But there's so many skills and errors that I try to remediate that there's just not a sort for everything I want to do. So it's just easy for me to come up with my own. All right, so thinking about all the ideas I listed on the last slide, I want you in a moment to hit pause, pick one of these errors, and think in your brain, how could I remediate that with Elkonin boards, a sound sort, or magnets or something like that, okay? So you're gonna just hit pause and think it through on your own. Okay, ready? And hit pause. Okay, so hopefully you thought through some of these. Here are some of my answers. When you have a child who's struggling with, can you see this? Why can't I figure this out? Here are two different cups with short I and short E on them. By the way, this is during the COVID crisis, so I don't have all my educational materials with me. I don't normally use measuring cups. But anyways, a sort, this is a low budget sort. We have short E and short I. And I would say the word such, well, first I'd teach them. Then I would say the word bid. Sound it out. B-id. What vowel did you hear? Eh. And they would put their unicorn in the short I cup to vote for I. All right, how about this word? The word is sled. Sound it out. Sled. What vowel did your mouth make? What shape? What sound? Short E. Okay, and they put it in, and so on and so on. So it's just a way. The sort with the cute object is just the fun activity part of it, but the focus is you are getting that child to over and over segment and isolate that vowel, consider the shape of their mouth, and then acknowledge which letter goes with that. So that's a way to target that very specific phonological error that the child is making. If it's something for the end of words, like the P and B at the end of words, that's something I see all the time. Same activity, I just change these cups to P and B. All right. Let's see. Okay, so initial blends. Can we see this? So these are my Unifix or my reading rods here. I have sled. I could tell them, let's change sled to gled. And they would have to look at the word, sound it out, and make that change. Again, does this feel like spelling and phonics? Yes, but we're connecting spelling, the sounds to the print, and that's okay. And really strong phonological work can happen there. If I didn't want to have the print, I could have them do that change sled to gled activity on an Elkonin board, and they would have had 4 chips down, and they would have pulled off the first one and popped a different chip on the front to show me that that's where the change happened in the word. I love using these for long versus short. Same thing with Wilson magnets. It's the same exact thing. It's just some kids prefer these clicking to the magnets. Some kids like both, whatever. So if I said the word is tap, can you change tap to tape? And they would show me that that's going on. Can you change tape to ape? Can you change ape to at? And so on. So I'm drawing their attention to the sound and then pushing them to take that next step to match the letter that goes with it. When we're remediating phonics, the first thing we need to know is where on that continuum they fall. So maybe I didn't say this for phonemic awareness, but yes, you would have done your screener for phonemic awareness, and that tells you where in Hegarty or where in the Kilpatrick drills to start. And then also you're noticing the little errors that they make, and that's where you're zooming in and doing those sorts or Elkonin boards to target those little error patterns that keep creeping in. Okay, so for phonics, we've done their pretest with the quick phonics screener, and we're seeing where on that continuum of word study that they fall. So I tend to use, well, I always use the word Gillingham scope and sequence because that's internalized in my brain. You could also use Wilson or Foundations, Project Read, something else that's a structured literacy program would be fine. There's little differences here and there, but nothing too dramatic. You would not want to rely on like the LLI, Level Literacy Intervention by Fontes and Pinnell. That would not be a trustworthy program for this kind of intervention work. If students need heavy phonics work, that's not going to be helpful to them. Reading recovery, not going to be helpful. Okay, so we've plotted their start point on that scope and sequence, and I usually go backwards a little bit from where they need work. I don't start right where my students need work. I go back a little bit because I'm trying to build this foundation. If you're working in a school and you've already been working on that foundation with them, you might not do that. For private work or one-on-one stuff at a school, I don't know that they've necessarily been given that foundation in their classroom. So because I don't have that knowledge, I start earlier with them. So then I'm teaching them concepts, whatever I'm teaching them, sounds, letters, skills, syllable division, techniques. We're doing it one at a time systematically. I am not teaching Bossier, vowel team, syllable division, and a spelling rule all in one lesson. We're not doing all of that at once. All of those would be its own lesson and then broken down even further. Like vowel teams, a lot of times each vowel team is its own lesson. Sometimes I might teach EA and EE on the same day for kids, other times not. Don't be afraid of going slowly. If nobody will ever go as slow as you do. You are the only person who's slowing things down for this student. So that's a good thing. That means you're the only one who's kind of giving them this foundation and this chance to learn and develop at that lower level where they are. Their classroom teacher is not, probably, because they can't. They're moving on with the curriculum. So you're going to be doing some direct teaching here. So with the phonemic awareness we just saw, I put that as like a warm-up, and that's troubleshooting drills that happen every lesson. But the phonics piece is usually like the meat of the lesson, and there's going to be some direct teaching there. Now, there might also have to be some academic language that gets taught, especially thinking to our ELL students. But the term vowel team, you might think, oh, that's a teacher word, or diphthong. Those are the words we're teaching kids, because those are the words that explain the structure of language. Just like kids have to know what a sum is in math, because the math test will say, find the sum, they have to know what a vowel team is. And you might be thinking, why do they need that knowledge? That takes away the beauty of reading and the fun and the pleasure of it. If these kids aren't reading, there's no beauty in reading for them. We've got to teach them the structure of reading so they can unlock it, and then they can dive in and access the beauty and the wonder of written language and of stories and books. We're emphasizing the 6 syllable types, those patterns. Now, I don't always dive right in with that. A lot of times, I don't care in kindergarten, first grade, even early second grade if they can handle syllable types, because I just want them to decode accurately and reliably, close syllable words. Then once we've got that and we're going to bring in vowel, consonant E, then I might start to talk about syllable types, but I might just call them patterns, and I might make a big stink about how, let's see if I can, this is not a real word, really, but hape versus hap. Then that's when patterns really matter, because you are showing kids that the visual that we see in the word is connected to the vowel sound that our mouth is going to say. And that helps us as a speller and as a reader. Okay, so the 6 syllable types, even if you don't start there by talking about it, ideally that is framing all the work you do, and you will bring them up to that level where they can start to see that, oh, our words are made up of all these syllable types and patterns, plus morphology, plus irregular words. But, you know, mostly it's the 6 syllable types. Then, and this is the part where the engagement and the human to human fun of the lesson comes out. It's the way that we practice. You can have a boring black and white word list that they highlight and they read to you, and that doesn't feel great. It's really structured, it's remedial, great, it's targeted, but it doesn't feel good for the students a lot. So this is where you bring the art of your teaching, your personality, your creativity into it, and you make all the practice work that they have to do throughout the lesson, try to make that as meaningful and fun as possible. So I have my students read structured word lists every single lesson, or targeted word lists, meaning the word lists are only O consonant E, or they're only long A vowel teams, or they're only words that have the prefixes pre, pro, and miss, or whatever I'm working on. So everything I do is zoomed in and controlled, but I'm still making it lively and fun, either through my personality, you've already learned that, right? Or through the game or the tools that I let them use. Okay, so these might not look like the most fun activities, but some of our students are easier to please than others. So when we're doing our review and our practice, well, at the beginning part of a structured literacy plan, I always have review from the last day, the last week, the last month, whatever just needs to be kept on the front burner and can't quite be released yet, whatever needs to be kept up, that's how I start my review. And then with the new concept, that's usually a little bit harder. So that might not be in a game form, because it might be the new stuff that we're doing games with. And maybe the review is the game stuff a lot of times, and the new stuff is more like the pencil and paper analytical work. There are lots of things that you can find for free online. Sometimes I have my favorite websites that I go to that have good materials pre-made, but a lot of times I just like to do my own games. When you're in the reading clinic, you'll be buying this book, the Orton Gillingham Word Finder, and it has for each of the skills that you're teaching, it will have a word list ready to go that follows our OG scope and sequence. So when I'm making games or word lists, I usually, this is by my side, I just flip it open, I've got the words that I need. And it's not really a set it and forget it kind of a thing, because right now I'm teaching blends to a lot of different students. I've got a 4th grader who is severely dyslexic, and this is the very first intervention he's ever had. So he's starting at the bottom with me. He started with short vowels. And then I have a 1st grader who's made rapid progress and responded really well to my intervention. And so it's just flying through the early level stuff. So the kinds of blends that my 1st grader is reading and my 4th grader are reading are different. My 4th grader, I have him working almost always at the multisyllabic level, and my 1st grader, I don't. You know what I mean? So it depends. So I don't just have like my one blends game and then that's it. I reprint it or reuse it every time. I'm constantly shifting the words to fit that kid. That's why I just don't always find it helpful to just buy products that are pre-made, because the work I'm doing is so targeted. So anyways, but this, like, if you look at this right here, we have different things that you could find online, or you could just print out the little words. Sorts, again, like this is a visual word sort. You see short A, closed syllable, A consonant E, AI. Word sorts help to build up those orthographic patterns in the brain. This helps with spelling. So especially for the A consonant E versus the A, students knowing which spelling of long A do we use, there's not a rule for it. So they just have to build up that visual knowledge of it and giving them lots of practice and then drawing their attention to the list. Oh, let's look at the words that use the A consonant E spelling. Read me the words with the A consonant E spelling. You're helping them sort in their brain. It's not going to happen fast for our struggling students. They're going to need lots of exposures, more than a typical kid. So those flashcards are going to be something that come up every day, and these are going to be things that you can use. This will be a way for you to just to review and keep things on the front burner. They're not particularly fun. I do it rapidly. I don't spend 10 minutes on flashcards because I know every time the child sees me, we get to do these. So I'm playing the long game. I don't want to kill them with flashcards in the beginning of the lesson and have them, despise me in our time together. I'm short and sweet and targeted with our flashcards, but they are so important because they're multisensory. They have a color, they're color coded, and when I lay out the words on the table, there's that visual pattern for them to see. So I really never skip those. Okay, and then for word lists, these are the more fun games that I was trying to describe. So my favorite are roll and read, color the chunk, and 4 in a row, because it's basically just gives you an excuse to have them read and reread the words over and over. So the Measured Mom, themeasuredmom.com makes, I think, all 3 of these. So again, they're called roll and read, color the chunk, 4 in a row. Color the chunk might be this Reading Mama, I forget. But I can send you those links too. I think they're actually on Blackboard in our links section. Those are my favorites. I also use her blank templates and I make my own because I told you I like to do my own words in my own word list so they match what that child is working on. And this is a great way to have them do a word list, and you can always have them read and reread, and it's just more fun than reading a piece of paper because it feels like a game. Okay, I'm not going to have us really pause for this one. If we were live in class, I would. But the idea is if you were planning a word list or a game for review purposes, you would want it to be very targeted. So you would pull out your word finder once you get to the OG practicum and you're in that stage, or maybe you have another kind of curriculum which has the word list and the word study words, because it's pretty hard to just Google words with digraphs because you're going to get all sorts of words. You want to zoom in on only including patterns that the child can decode. They've been taught by you to decode those patterns. So if you're teaching CH to a first grader, the word church probably isn't going to show up on your word list because it has that R controlled vowel right in the middle. The word beach probably isn't going to show up on your word list. If you're teaching a digraph, you're probably doing that before you taught vowel teams and R controlled. So that's where you have to have this knowledge of this scope and sequence in your brain. And if you're using the OG curriculum or scope and sequence, that will help you keep track of things. But you don't just want to Google CH words, because somebody on Teacher Pay Teacher could have they could have the word chirp or cheat. And that's not what our students are doing. That's not as controlled. So you know your student, you know what you've taught, you know what kinds of words they can handle. So now we're moving into fluency. We've talked a little bit about what remediating phonemic awareness looks like, what remediating phonics looks like, remediating fluency. What does that look like? Well, technically it's woven into all parts of the lesson, because if we're thinking about being automatic and accurate, we want that at the phonological level, at the letter knowledge level, decoding, phrasing, so all of it. Probably when you think of fluency, you're thinking of reading sentences and paragraphs smoothly. So assuming that we've already developed fluency with those lower level foundation skills, let's look upwards or forwards and think about fluency with connected text. So you probably remember this from your other courses. We're thinking about automaticity, the rate, accuracy, and prosody. If a student has poor fluency on their DIBELS and they're consistently below grade benchmark on their oral reading fluency, you would first want to eliminate that decoding is an issue. Because if decoding is an issue, then that's why their fluency is so poor. Sometimes the child will make 0 errors or only 1 error, and decoding is still the issue. But to the naive teacher, it appears that no, they're just a poor reader. They're not fluent. I can't get their speed to go up. It's taking so much cognitive work for them to decode those words, and they're doing it. They're doing it accurately, but it's taking so much work that their fluency is suffering, and then therefore probably their comprehension too. So some of our students trick us. They look like they can decode, but because of the amount of effort it takes, that shows us that they are really not automatic with decoding. And they would be served well if we went backwards on that decoding continuum and improved their automatic and rapid kind of word attack skills. So, and you know what? Sometimes if their spelling is really horrendous, but they're reading with very few errors, that alerts us that they have very poor knowledge of the code. So if we see terrible spelling, low fluency, even though they're accurate, that shows us that there's an issue going on and they do need code work. It will help them with their spelling, and it will helpfully help them rapidly, using their orthographic processor, rapidly identify those patterns and be able to decode the words more efficiently. So how do we do this? So one, we're going back, we're doing the phonics. Let's say that's happening, good. We're also going to now zoom in specifically on phrasing and sentence level reading. It's important to break down exactly what fluency is for these kids. If we're just talking about read fluently, they probably think we mean read fast, because that's what the DIBELS or oral reading fluency tests seem to be doing, seeing how fast they can read. So we want to make sure that they know that that's not what reading is entirely about. I believe this was posted online for you, this fluency rubric. This is from Rosinski. He's sort of the fluency guru out there. I don't find this to be very child-friendly because each box on the rubric has a lot of text, but I do find it helpful for me to see the different ways a child can have strengths and weaknesses. So I believe it says expression and volume, phrasing, smoothness, and pace. So you can adjust that to be student-friendly, the little descriptors in the boxes. But for you as a teacher, that might be interesting for you to think, okay, which one of these is an issue for my student? Speaking of checklists, online I also posted another checklist that has about 6 things, and it's literally a checklist. And I like to use that to tell my students exactly what we're zooming in on. It has things like punctuation, reading accurately, meaning no errors, scooping phrases, things like that. So it helps me to zoom in. Wow, these are the things that you already do as a reader. Let's look at this third one right here, reading punctuation. Today we're going to practice that. And then when I have that checklist out, that helps me direct their attention to just that one little element of fluency that we're zooming in on, as opposed to just magically putting it all together somehow by me saying, read fluently, and them knowing what I mean. It helps to break it down and give them something to target. And then also my instruction can match. I can have them highlight all the periods or exclamation points so that they are alerted to them. Or in the middle of the slide here, you see how the teacher had them scoop phrases. That's alerting them to what the different elements and the different strategies they might use to be fluent. So I've also used, if you want to work on accuracy and automaticity, you would want to use a lower level passage. So you can see on the slide that at family passage, having them find all those at words. You could do this at the upper level too with a more complex pattern, but that's a way for them to zoom in on these word families. You're telling them, you know these words, you can read them right away. Let's try, instead of sounding out today, since we already practiced them in our preview, you snap it together out loud. So if you're pushing them away from sound tapping every word into more automatic reading, you might want to make the text really controlled so that they actually have a chance at that. You also see that little roll a phrase thing. So they roll the dice, they read a phrase. So phrase work, this is really good for sight words. I do that with sight words a lot. In the house, could you please, I don't know, I can't think of any now. You can actually find those online too. You could do Dolch word phrases or sight word phrases. But again, I like to make my phrases very specific to the sight words that we have been practicing together. And it takes seconds just to type up 10 phrases with the sight words that your child knows. And you can squeeze in some of the decodable words too, if you wanted. But once I'm making good progress with decoding with my kids, I try to think, okay, of the things we've already practiced with decoding, can I kick it up a notch with the fluency? I don't expect fluency of the new patterns that we're reading, you know, those new stories, the new complex patterns, but for the old stuff that we've been working on, and I know they can do accurately, that's where I'm going to push them fluency wise. So my phrases for roll a phrase or tic-tac-toe with phrases might be more, it might be the old decodable words with some sight words. You can see that little timer thing down there. You can always do timed drills. If they respond well to a little competition with themselves, then great. Incorporate timed drills into your lesson. Words on flashcards, phrases, passages, whatever they'd like. But don't just give them random passages to read fluently and expect that to be what improves their work. You would want your fluency drills to be covering their old knowledge, things they've already learned with you. Maybe once you're done with short vowels, you'd work on short speed with short vowels. You know what I mean? You don't just give them a list and expect them that the timer itself will make them be a better reader. That's not what makes them a better reader. When they know the patterns and when they know the code, the timer can be a little nudge that helps them snap things together, but you would have had to do direct teaching and nice guided practice for a while first. Controlled practice, that's a better word. I don't want you thinking about guided reading. Okay, we have our little sailboat up there. There's all sorts of cutesy ways online too to take a sentence or a phrase and build upon it as well. And you can make your own, or you can find some examples. I'll have you think this through on your own. This will just be a nice little meditative moment. I'll hit pause and you can, or I'll tell you to hit pause and you can think through at each level here. I don't mean grade level, but I mean like learning level here. What kind of fluency work might help this student advance their skills? So assuming you've given them some direct instruction, what kinds of fluency expectations might you have for them? So you can hit pause and think about that for a moment. A big question people have when they start to do this kind of work is, how do I error handle? What do I do when they say the wrong word? Should I let them go on? Should I call them out on it? So let's talk through the different scenarios. Getting feedback from a teacher is huge for children who are developing their knowledge of the code. Some of our students are more sensitive than others, so we might pick our battles or be more gentle or let something slide. Some of our children have a really low tolerance for frustration and correction. Building up trust is going to help you with this. So if you are constantly cheerful, if you don't get mad at them, even when they're horrific, if they have a really bad day and they push something off the table or throw it, this happens to me often, you don't scold them or get mad at them for acting out because they're here to do the very hardest thing in their academic life with you. So we can't really hold that against them. We can have expectations for behavior and be clear and firm, but we can also empathize with them and say, I know this is hard. I see you come to me every week. I want to make sure that our time together, you get to do lots of learning. If we need breaks, we back off, we take breaks. If something's too hard and you need to shift, we can do that. So you give them those outs, not so that they have you wrapped around their finger, but so that they trust you. Because about half of the students I see have behavior issues or attention issues on top of reading. And if I don't acknowledge that and figure out a way to deal with that, yeah, our lessons, they go south. Nothing can happen. The student has to trust you. Okay, so let's say they trust you and they can deal with some error correction. What do we say when they read a word the wrong way? So it depends. Now, it's based on the kind of word it is. So is it a decodable word? Is it a sight word? Is it a word that they should be held accountable for because you have taught them that sight word or you have taught them that pattern? Or is it a word that snuck into your story that's beyond, what's expected of them? We do not want, some of our students will be relying on context, but our skilled readers, they don't have to have context to read. A truly skilled reader can decode the words in front of them. I could give you a medical word that you've never seen before, and you could decode it well enough. You might not get the accent on the right syllable or something like that, but you would be able to decode that word. You're not just relying on context to guess what kind of word should come next. And some of our struggling readers are very savvy and they are very good at guessing what word comes next. And then when they get to a word where they got it wrong because they just filled in the blank and they happen to guess wrong, they don't have any backup strategies for how to figure it out. So yes, our brain does fill in the gaps, but when we're with kids, we don't want to be using that. That's not our instructional MO. We don't want kids to be guessing what makes sense. What does the picture show you? No, we want to always be pushing them back towards the code. So this means if we're going to be expecting them to read with some accuracy, we have to have a text that's just right. This is different things for different kids. This could be decodable text like those Spire books you see there, or it could be trade books like the National Geographic. That's a nonfiction book that's not controlled at all. It says level 2, but that's made up by the publisher. That has nothing, that really has no bearing on what we're doing. And then I have some poetry books. A lot of times I use the poetry books with the older kids because I find it's harder for them to guess what comes next. So if I have a 4th or 5th grader or middle schooler and they've been relying on context to guess the next word and that's been working for them well enough, you cannot guess the next word in a Shel Silverstein poem. I mean, maybe a little word like in or the, but he uses made up words, he uses old-fashioned words, he uses surprising words. So I find like that's a good way for me to practice with my students by kind of ripping them away from guessing what comes next and using their knowledge, which I'm glad they have that, but I also want them to be directed more towards using their knowledge of the code. And so by giving them something that's a little less predictable, that pushes my older students in that direction. Younger students, I don't want to challenge them and make them feel that frustrated, so I would give them something that is very dependable because I want them to see proof. Yes, the code works. Look at this book. I told you AI says A. Here it is right here. This book is full of words with AI that say A. You don't want to teach them an AI lesson and then read some random book that doesn't even include that pattern because that might undermine all your phonics instruction, So you want to be pushing kids back towards the code, and sometimes that means using decodable books, and sometimes not. It's tempting to, when they make an error, go oh or tick, 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 and you can kind of tap at it, or this word, or just giving them the word. Try not to do that, and certainly don't cue them to look at the picture. You could say things like, does this make sense? Or let's tap that out, or what's the first letter? You're pushing them back towards the code in a gentle way. Again, I'm thinking of a few of my students who I am very choosy about what kinds of errors I hold them accountable for because they have a very low threshold for frustration. So I'm very cautious of the errors I ask them to follow up on, and I will give them certain words. Oh, that's a teacher word, or we haven't learned that word yet, and I'm more likely to jump in than I am with some of my other kids. Beware of some commercial posters, especially in the guided reading world and balanced literacy world, that give bad advice, such as look at the picture. What's the first sound is fine, but we don't want to guess on what's the first sound. When I say what's the first letter, I'm directing them to then sound out the whole word. That's just like step 1, find the first letter. We don't want them to look at the first letter and guess house when the word is really home or something like that. I don't want them to read ahead and see if you can figure it out, or ask a friend, or look it up in the dictionary. That's like the worst advice. That never helps anyone, right? So beware. Those posters are big time out there in classrooms, on Pinterest, on Teacher Pay Teachers. What we want is to direct them to either sound out the word, if it's a one-syllable word. Do they see any word parts they know, like prefixes, suffixes? Um, Maybe there's a word family. We want them to be analytical about the word. So more specifically, this isn't for all of our kids, because you're going to have a rapport with your kids and develop an error handling technique that makes sense for them and their personality. But in general, I'd let them finish and see if they do some self-correcting, because that's what I ideally want, is for them to notice that that didn't make sense and correct themselves. If not, I might say, this word tricked you, or try this again, or sound tap this word. Um, but in order to error handle, you've got to know that student well, and you've got to know the content well, because you have to know what kind of pressure can they accept from me. What have I already taught them, or what have they learned so far? So what's fair to hold them accountable for? And why might this word have tricked them? You know, if it's a one-syllable word, CENT, and you've done close syllables and final blends, and you're like, why aren't they getting this word? It could be because it has a soft C at the beginning and they haven't done that yet. In that case, you need to know the content, and you need to know, although we know short vowels, although we know blends, they don't know the soft C. So this will be a teacher word that I'll give them. You wouldn't direct them to sound out something that they haven't learned to do yet. It's just not one size fits all. So our error handling isn't either, you know? So like I said on one of the last slides, you need to rapidly know what kind of a word it is, because that will tell you how to direct the child. If it's a one-syllable word, it's usually a sounding out thing. If you know that you've been working on R controlled and vowel teams, you might point to them, what kind of vowel do you see there? Is it a sight word that's not decodable? Have you learned it yet? Have you not? Is it a multisyllabic word where they can apply their word breaking skills? Does it have a prefix or suffix, and you can tell them to cover up the prefix suffix and read the base word? So you're going to be cueing them differently depending on what kind of word it is, and you should be able to notice in a millisecond what kind of word it is. We want you to have that automatic knowledge. Now, if you can't, I said if you prompt her 3 or more times, I mean, you might know sooner than that she's not going to figure out the word. You can give her the word and move on. And then that's when I make a note to myself that this is the word that stumped her, or she didn't know how to apply her word attack here. Or sometimes it's a good note I'm writing, like, wow, we haven't learned that complex syllable division yet, but she just applied our basic syllable division rule to that complex word and got it. So I would make a note about that too, because that's really impressive to see. And that helps me as a teacher see how they're applying their skills. And that child might end up moving at a quicker pace through the concepts than somebody else. Okay, for this slide, I think you can just hit pause and read it over to yourself and think about the different ways that you could coach a student through error handling. So you can hit pause. So after the error is fixed, this is the tricky part, because ideally you want the child to go back and read the sentence or phrase with the corrected word. So I usually say, all right, let's pretend you had trouble reading the word error in the title of this slide. I would say something like, okay, now that you know the word error, can you go back and reread this sentence with the word error? So see what I did? I just said the word there twice for you to help you, and now you're rereading it and you're more likely to get the word that time. So in a way, I'm giving it to you, but we've already error handled, like the way you saw on the last slide. So now I'm having you reread it smoothly, and I want that to anchor it. Because if you just moved on and we error handled it, but we didn't like reread it within the context of the whole sentence, that's just not as impactful. Also, we want to promote comprehension. The point of reading is to understand and engage with the text. And if all we're doing is troubleshooting here and there, we're missing the meaning of the text. We always want our students to be rereading and like snapping it all together to make sense of what it means. And like I said, you're going to write down what kind of cueing didn't work or work. Not just which words did they read or not read well, but what did you do that prompted them that helped? So prompted to sound tap, that's something I wrote. Applied syllable division strategy, or was frustrated, or resorted to guessing words. You know what I mean? Whatever was happening, record that, because that's going to help you with your next lesson. You're going to know what to build off of, what to go back and review. Maybe this text was a terrible choice and it was too hard. Maybe it was too easy. If the text is too hard, back off. You know what I mean? Like it's frustrating to the student, even if it's something that's important to them. If you're stumbling your way through it, that's not working. It's one thing that I've done before. If it's a chapter book that's really important to a child, I might do a screenshot of a page and enlarge it so we can like write right on the page, like print it out or do it on the screen, and they can mark up that page. Or sometimes I've even, like with a decodable text, even if the decodable is too hard, I've taken a screenshot of that photo or that drawing, and then I write my own more simplified text that goes with it, because I don't want my students to be struggling through their text. That's not the point of all this. We need to have some opportunity for them to snap it all together. As you know, struggling readers must consume loads of text every day. Think of this. Their peers who are not struggling are reading books in reading group. They're reading books during silent reading. They might even be taking home their library books from school and reading for pleasure at home. They're just reading the signs and the worksheets and the packets that, you know, come across their plate. They're reading so much, and our struggling readers are reading so little. Partially because they're getting instructional time instead of just open reading time. Because they don't like reading, because it's hard for them, and because the kind of text we give them is so short and limited in depth, they're just not getting as much. So yes, we need to really focus and zoom in and do the decodable text and the controlled word list, but as much reading as possible should happen in your lesson. If you are skipping the part where they're reading actual text, you're doing it wrong. I mean, unless you have like a really, really low kindergartner and they can't even blend yet. But the point is to always push them towards text. So don't get caught up and stuck on phonics games only. Be directing them and always thinking of how can I be doing sentence level, phrase level, and then actual books within my lesson.